Good morning. It's September 27th, 2022. It is a Tuesday. I'm actually off of work all week, so I'm trying to catch up on a bunch of these things. It struck me dumb when I realized, as I started doing these little kind of like book talk and book report kind of things, that I didn't start out with this one I'm about to tell you now. I actually have this book in an audio form. I got it from the library so many years ago. And to say it makes the rounds of re-listening pretty often, I would not be exaggerating. I could probably say I've listened to it about 12 to 15 times since I've gotten it, which is odd to keep going back to a book, but it's just so uniquely interesting to me. Not only in the subject matter and what you have to pay attention to, but also in the fact that it's an oral biography type of book. I have a couple other examples I will share, and it's just an interesting way of writing that it just strikes me well. So, without further ado, here we go. This is Chuck Palahniuk. He's a very famous author, but he's the kind of author that you gotta kind of know him in order to even try to read his stuff. My last one that I did here, I think, was with Andrew Vox on Bloodline, his new book. He's another one. I don't think I've ever talked to anybody who's talked about Andrew Vox before. And now, Chuck Palahniuk, some people just get on him and love him. He definitely has a niche. He's got a cult following, so to speak, because he's very good. But if you're not into that kind of writing or that kind of story subject matter, you're going to dismiss it. You're not going to know anything about it. But here it is. RANT, an oral biography of Buster Casey. Let's talk about Chuck Palahniuk for a second. As my phone beeps off. So one thing about Chuck Palahniuk is everyone knows that he was the guy who wrote Fight Club. And everyone knows Fight Club because there was a famous movie about it. A lot of people might see the movie and then go to the book, and now you're introduced to this author, and they move forward from there. But he has so many other works, and they're all from unique points of view. If you go through Choke, if you go through Pygmy, if I think there's the one about it's almost like they go through hell, but it's in that, hey God, are you listening? It's me, Margaret kind of point of view. That's how the entire book of A Person Who Damned to Hell goes through. But again, I'm not here to talk about those. That's just who this author is. I'm pretty sure I'm correct when I say his last name is pronounced Palanhiuk. It's a very unique spelling, and hopefully I'm not doing him any injustice. Now I'm going to talk about this book, and then I'm going to get into what oral biographies are and other ones I have listened to. Now, RANT is a very unique book to even attempt to summarize. And the reason is because it takes place over a long period of time in this person's life, and it jumps back and forth between it. There's also a small aspect of a little time travel in the third act of this book. And the fact is that because people are talking about the character, you never know who's telling the truth because you only get their perception. And their perception, obviously, is a reflection of their character. But RANT Casey, Buster Casey is actually his real name, grew up in this small Midwest town. Not much was going on, so he was pretty bored most of the time. He came from a unique family background as well, but he was kind of a bored kid and a little apathetic on certain things. So one of the things that he did for his own amusement was to get bitten by various insects, by spiders, by snakes, you name it. He literally would place his arm into a hole and hopefully it would bite him, and then he would get the venom. And then the venom would have whatever effects have on him. Sometimes it gives him an erection. Sometimes it just makes him feel good. It was just interesting enough that was his focus in life. So over the course of getting so many bites and you name it, he obviously gets rabies, but he actually eventually develops a different sort of genotype of the rabies, which then eventually leads, when he goes into a big city later in his life, to the beginnings of what's a global pandemic of rabies. And he is the progenitor of this new strain of rabies. So everyone's getting infected left, right, and center just by being near him, and saliva being exchanged, or maybe he chews on a pencil and someone else borrows it and chews on it as well. The saliva just goes everywhere. And all of a sudden, everyone's got rabies. Now, there's a dystopian future that kind of develops from this, because society now attempts to separate those with rabies into a nighttime culture and those without rabies into a daytime culture. And they're called nighttimers and daytimers. And in this future, they actually have curfews on each. So they all live in the same world, and they might all work the same jobs, but there's a daytime crew for the day, then they go home, and then the nighttime crew happens, and they actually service the needs and wants of the nighttime people. So things like a dry cleaner would stay open all day long, because you have daytime people who want their dry cleaning done, and the nighttime people. Same thing with food preparation, or even restaurants. Restaurant can be open all day long because you have the daytime crowd for like breakfast and lunch, and the nighttime crowd for like their dinner and then maybe an end of meal, or the dinner would be their breakfast, I guess, and the end of dinner, the end of night would be their dinner. You get the idea. So that's the setting, and everything happens and it takes place. Now, what actually ends up happening is there is a culture that has grown up where people actually kind of like race cars and bumper car throughout the night. And they play this game. And this game actually is party crashing, they call it. Where you get some beat up cars, and literally you'll drive around and try to like tag other drivers. You're not trying to like demolition derby and destroy them head on collisions. You're trying to just give a little love tap. And you get points for that. And there's an agency somewhere that keeps track of players, keeps track of what the game is going to be every night, and keeps track of the points. And people are really into this. And it turns out it's more of a nighttime thing than a daytime thing. So party crashing is a thing that comes back to pretty often. Now, the book is following the life of this guy named Rant, and how this thing started, what his childhood was like, what his girlfriends were like, how the rabies began and how it affects other people, how he goes into party crashing and everything else. However, the book is told from the points of view of everyone else. In fact, you only get Rant's voice like for 2 sentences throughout the entire book. The rest of it is physically told from the point of view of other people. And every time their opinion is looked for, it starts with them introducing themselves. So a woman will come over and say, "I'm Rant's mother." Rant never did all those things that people are talking about. He was just a good old boy. And then it was switched to his friend, and he would start out his section going, "Shot Dunyan. Yeah, Rant and I actually did these things. We went out and got a whole bunch of animal parts and created this Halloween kind of like touch it in a bowl and you can tell what it is. So we put some pig intestines in a bowl and we put blindfold on a kid and charged him money to go through our funhouse. And he would grab the intestines and we tell him, this is intestines." But the mother's point of view would be like, "Nah, it was just a bowl of spaghetti. I don't know why people thought that he got all this, animal parts from," and yada yada. And then one by one, everyone's opinion comes into play. So you get the history of Rant through other people's eyes based on what's happening throughout the time of his life. That's only one really small, section of the book. It goes into, in the future, people actually have like electronics implanted in their bodies so they can record what they see and what they smell and what they hear. We call it outcording to a tape or a disc, and then someone else can actually buy that, plug it into themselves, and experience that. So there are people who have a whole industry related to this technology. But the problem is, sometimes you get a little bit of rabies, your sense of taste starts to go. Your vision might start to fade. So the people who are really in this industry now can't really get into it. Now, things suddenly start to change later on because the 2 times you actually hear Rant's voice, he is physically on the radio trying to get into a hard enough crash that he thinks he's going to jump in time. They say if you're about to go into like some life-threatening crash or you fall from a building, your whole life flashes before your eyes. You're actually experiencing a moment called liminal time. And at liminal time, you're not just getting memories, you might actually be kind of traveling a little bit into there. Well, people have learned that sometimes with these crashes, you may physically be able to time travel. And that's what's going on here. In fact, this whole party crashing might have been started by people who were trying to avoid the fact that people rubberneck. And they were getting into all these crash simulations because they were experiencing this moment of liminal time. And the harder and harder they crashed, the more they were experiencing it. So some people believe the first time travelers were actually this agency that was doing these party crashing, trying to get into such a life-threatening, see your whole life flash before your eyes, liminal time space, that they were physically going back in time. Again, it's a very hard book to describe. I can only give you bits and pieces, but to put it together in one narrative is very difficult, and I apologize for that as much as I possibly can. So, that's this book. I'm sorry, I might not have sold it enough to you, but my just zeal for it should tell you something, hopefully. Now, I'm going to finish up talking about oral biographies in general. This is the first one that I had actually listened to or that I actually read. I prefer the audiobook for this due to the fact that it was done with a completely full cast. So every single person that was in the book has a different voice and different inflection and different style, and they're suave or not suave, whatever it is. And there are dozens of characters in this book. Some just appear for a blip, and some are there constantly. And they actually get some pretty good voices in this, too. The woman who voices Echo Lawrence, for instance, her story and how she relates to being Rand's girlfriend and what she sees seems to be like a very primary focus through everything. There's also the man, and I'm sorry I forget his, I don't know his name off the top of my head, who plays Green Taylor Sims, who's a historian. He's also a nighttimer and a party crasher. Whenever he comes in with his voice, which is so smooth, by the way, he just tells a history of why people are doing what they're doing and what his part in that is. And it becomes a very important part of the story as it moves on as well. So the oral biography, literally, is people keep jumping in with their points of view on an event or on something that happened to them. And the good thing about it is it just allows you to see it from different perspectives, even though it's the exact same event. And that's where the whole, is this real or is this not real, really comes into effect. Because literally, you can have two people who have an argument in a fight, and the one person's like, what is wrong with that person? They are so weird. The fact that we got into a fist fight is not surprising. And the other one was like, I was just minding my own business, and this person really got up in my face. I don't know why, but I had to push him off. So you get to see that. And it just jumps enough from event to event to event that these different opinions from different voices of different very unique characters just really bursts out of the page. And by listening by audio and actually getting a separate voice, you can actually apply who's speaking and remember exactly what they did every time in the past. Because the voice brings you along. Again, loved it. It actually got me to start looking out for other oral biography type books. And I did find at least two others. They're both fiction, both futuristic as well, that fit this. The one is World War Z. This is one of those ones that the movie didn't really happen in the book, from my perspective. Now, granted, I only listened to it once. But World War Z was like an anthology of different zombie-type encounters from when the plague might have, if you want to call it a plague, but when the plague began to whenever it ended up or maybe got cured for the whole world. But In World War Z, you might have, oh, here's the zombie apocalypse beginning, and I was just out eating lunch one day, and as I went back to my car, some dude kind of like scrambled up to me, and what the hell is that? Then it would jump over into a story like there were Marines that were overseas, and they were like in combat, and the combat was over, but after a while they kind of ran out of bullets. But now all these zombies are erupting, but they're an elite unit of the United States military. So what do they start doing is they start taking like their little shovels that they use to like take a shit in the woods or something like that, or the sand, and they start turning the blades sideways and making battle axes out of them. And they encounter other ways that they can be adaptive and using weapons in their training now to fight the zombies. Because after a while, the bullets will just run dry. So let's go hand-to-hand combat with this stuff. And with the military, there also ended up things where they'll tell a separate story, or a different group tells a separate story of, by the way, zombies don't have to breathe. They can literally just walk underwater. So water, while people were safe on boats, maybe, and they could live there and only come to shore when they needed supplies, if they ever got into the water, forget the sharks. I forget whether or not the sharks got zombified too, but forget the sharks. There might just literally be a dead guy below you. And you jump in the water, he grabs your foot, and ba. So there's a whole thing everywhere you turn. There's a nice little story too about a pilot who gets shot down over some forest, but happens to catch somebody on the radio. And they talk to each other every now and again, and the person on the radio guides them to safety. But by the way, watch out for the ones that are in cars, don't light a fire, gives the pilot all sorts of advice. But then, as the person gets closer to the radio signal, realizes that the person on the other end doesn't really exist. But you got to see a zombie story from a survivalist point of view. Now, each of these parts, again, are voiced by different people. So, they're very unique, it's very short stories, they're anthologies, but they're all set in the same world of the zombie apocalypse. I think the other one... There's another one which I'm sorry I forget the name of. There's kind of like a oral history, and there's a robot uprising. I think it doesn't do too many short stories. Let me go find it real quick. Robot uprising. Robopocalypse. Oh, I was going to say Metalopocalypse, but I think that's a cartoon instead. So Robopocalypse is the same thing. Robopocalypse, I think, is kind of like a Terminator set type of thing where the robots are starting to become sentient and starting to take over. And here we're going to tell some stories of how people have been fighting robots and how they're living in this I can't use technology kind of robot world. So it all kind of comes back to how RANT got me involved with oral biographies, fictional ones, and this ends up being the greatest of them. World War Z is very, very good too. By the way, World War Z, you do get Mark Hamill voicing a guy from Yonkers, New York. Great story there. And then Robopocalypse being another one, and I'm sure there are plenty other ones out there. So, bottom line is, give RANT a try. Again, I'd say go audio, but it's up to you. And I hope I've been able to give you some information or even introduce you to something that's new, either the oral biographies or the author or the story in general. Okay, I'm going to wrap this one up now. Thank you very much. Like always, if you like this, tell me you like it. If you subscribe, get the numbers up. I could do this more often, hopefully full time. We'll see what happens. Take care. Happy reading.